In this video, we are going to be examining some of the philosophical questions raised by Disney's 2012 3D computer animated film, Wreck-It Ralph. The film was a critical and commercial success, and has spawned a sequel called Ralph Breaks the Internet, which was released in 2018. However, we will be focusing solely on the original from 2012. If you haven't seen the movie, I'll include a link in the description. It's well worth a watch. Either way, I'll now give you a brief summary of what happens in the film to give you the gist if you haven't seen it, or to refresh your memory if you have. So, obviously, warning, spoiler alert. The film takes place in the fictional Litwack's family fun centre and arcade. When it closes for the night, the various video game characters leave their respective consoles and travel to a shared power strip to socialise and relax. The main character of the film is called Wreck-It Ralph. He is the villain of the game Fix-It Felix Jr., and because of this he is shunned by the other characters in the game, while the hero Felix is loved and celebrated. We then discover that the console is 30 years old, and that the game's inhabitants intend to hold a party to celebrate. Unfortunately, Ralph is not invited. He crashes the party, and whilst Felix tries to welcome him, the other inhabitants of the game are clearly very unhappy to see him. Eventually, tempers boil over, and Ralph ends up arguing with one of the secondary characters. In a moment of anger, Ralph ends up ruining the party by smashing the cake. Very upset, Ralph sets out to earn a medal for himself, to gain his neighbour's respect, and to show that he too can be a hero, as opposed to his in-game status as a villain. Felix worries that Ralph has gone turbo. We learn that years ago, one of the most popular games in the arcade was a racing game called Turbo Time. Its titular character, Turbo, loved the attention he received because of its popularity. However, his popularity soon began to fade when a new racing game called Road Blasters was added to the arcade. As Turbo Times and thus Turbo's popularity began to fade, Turbo grew jealous. He then abandoned his own game and tried to take over Road Blasters. Unfortunately, this caused both of the games to malfunction, which caused them to be unplugged. This, it is implied, caused the permanent death of all the characters contained within the two consoles. As a result, the term going turbo or on turbo was coined. This is the single worst thing a video game character can do because it results in their game being unplugged and as a result in the death of all the characters contained within. Soon after, Ralph learns that he can get a medal from the first-person shooter game Hero's Duty. It is worth noting at this point that if a character dies outside of their game, they permanently die. On top of this, if a main character dies and the game no longer functions as a result, the whole console risks being unplugged. This makes everything that happens hereafter all the more dangerous. Ralph enters the game and scales the game's central beacon. He obtains a medal, but in the process he inadvertently hatches a cybug, a dangerous monster and the game's main antagonists. Ralph and the cybug fall into an escape pod which launches out of the game. It crash lands into another game called Sugar Rush, which is a candy-themed kart racing game. Whilst this has been going on, and with Ralph missing, his game, Fix-It Felix Jr., is labelled as malfunctioning and is scheduled to be unplugged. As a result, Felix goes in search of Ralph. He travels to Hero's Duty and teams up with the game's heroine, Sergeant Calhoun, to find Ralph and stop the cybug wreaking havoc. Back in Sugar Rush, a little girl called Penelope von Schweetz steals Ralph's medal. She does this so that she can buy her way into the nightly race that determines which characters are playable the next day. Unfortunately, the ruler of Sugar Rush, King Candy, forbids her from racing because she has glitches that cause her to teleport randomly. Ralph and Vanellope then decide to work together to retrieve Ralph's medal whilst winning Vanellope's race. They build a cart and Ralph teaches her how to drive it, whilst they hide in an unfinished racetrack inside the volcanic Diet Cola Mountain. However, King Candy is absolutely desperate to stop Vanellope racing, and so he hacks the game's code to obtain Ralph's medal. He then offers it to Ralph on the condition that Ralph prevent Vanellope from racing. He claims that if Vanellope wins and becomes playable, the glitches will lead to Sugar Rush being unplugged. Vanellope will be unable to leave the game because of her glitch, and so she will be left to die alone, while King Candy and his subjects become homeless in the power strip. Ralph sadly agrees and destroys Vanellope's cart. Vanellope is distraught and runs off. Ralph returns to his game, and whilst doing so, he notices that Penelope's image is on the side of the Sugar Rush console. He realizes that far from being a glitch, she is meant to be a playable character. Whilst all this is going on, Felix and Calhoun search Sugar Rush for Ralph. Felix soon falls in love with Calhoun, however, he reminds her of her late fiancé who was murdered by a cybug on their wedding day. As a result, she abandons him. Felix is soon imprisoned in King Candy's castle. Ralph travels back to Sugar Rush and encounters Sour Bill, one of King Candy's servants. Sour Bill explains that King Candy changed Penelope's code on purpose. When Ralph asks about his motivation for doing this, Sour Bill says he doesn't know, and that no one knows because King Candy locked up all the characters' memories when messing with the game's code. He explains that if Penelope crosses the finish line, the game will reset and that she will no longer be a glitch. Ralph travels to King Candy's castle and frees Felix and Penelope, who has also been captured. Felix then fixes Penelope's cart. Whilst this is going on, Calhoun discovers a swarm of cybug eggs underground, which start to hatch. He realizes that they will soon destroy the entire game. Penelope enters the race with her new and improved cart, but she is attacked by King Candy. Penelope's glitch causes him to be unmasked as Turbo, who took over Sugar Rush and replaced Penelope as the main character by messing with the game's programming. Penelope escapes Turbo using her glitch, and he is then eaten by a cybug. Ralph, Felix, and Calhoun evacuate the game whilst the cybugs swarm. However, as King Candy warned, Penelope is trapped due to her glitch. It appears that she will have to be left behind to die alone. Quick-thinking Calhoun then points out that cybugs can be drawn to and destroyed by a beacon of light. Ralph realizes that he can make Diet Cola Mountain erupt, which will replicate this effect. Whilst trying to do this, Ralph is confronted by the now monstrous Turbo, who is fused with the cybug that ate him. Ralph makes the mountain erupt, but in the process he has to sacrifice himself by falling into it. At the last second, however, Penelope saves him using her glitching ability. Ralph's plan works and the volcano permanently destroys the cybugs and Turbo. Penelope then crosses the finish line, which reboots Sugar Rush and restores her status and memory. It turns out she is no ordinary playable character. Rather, she is actually Princess Penelope, the main character of the game and rightful ruler of Sugar Rush. Ralph and Felix return home and their game is saved. Felix and Calhoun marry soon after, Penelope becomes one of the most popular characters in the arcade, and Ralph is content and happy having gained the respect of his fellow characters. This brings the film to a happy conclusion. There are lots of interesting themes running through this film, many of which could warrant a video of their own. Today, however, I want to focus on the idea of artificial intelligence. The characters in the film are artificial because they live in computers, but they are people with thoughts, hopes, dreams, and feelings. As a result, whilst the film is fictional, we can still ask whether or not characters like Ralph and Penelope, i.e. artificial people on a computer program, could ever really exist. Now, obviously, we can quite clearly program characters into computers. We do this all the time in video games, for example. But we don't tend to think these characters are actual real thinking, feeling people with free will. Instead, as they currently stand, video game characters merely represent or imitate people. They're merely pixels on a screen controlled by programs running on the computer. Unlike us, and unlike Ralph and Penelope, they don't have any subjective experiences, they lack a sense of self, and they don't have genuine substantive free will. This is a good thing given the way we often treat video game characters. If we thought for a minute that they were real people, then from a moral perspective, most of what goes on in video games is highly suspect, if not downright morally monstrous. But this raises an interesting question. Computers are still at an early stage of development, and if they continue to develop as they are now, future computers and future programming will vastly outstrip contemporary computers in every respect. In theory, then, using these computers and using more advanced programming, could we in principle create genuine artificial people with subjective experiences, a sense of self and some measure of free will? This question has taxed philosophers since the dawn of the computer age, and in this video I want to explore some of the arguments for and against this possibility. Before we proceed, it is worth distinguishing between two sorts of artificial intelligence, or AI. The first is called weak AI. Something has weak AI when it appears to have the full mental and psychological repertoire of persons. So something with weak AI would appear, at least at first glance, to have subjective experiences such as happiness, sadness, or pain, a sense of self, and some measure of free will. However, it would not actually have subjective experiences, a sense of self, or free will. It would only appear to have them. This is the sort of AI in which the Turing Test is interested. The Turing Test, if you're not aware, is a test originally proposed by one of the founding fathers of modern computer science, Alan Turing. The Turing Test is designed to test a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to or indistinguishable from that of a human. The test involves a human evaluator carrying out two hidden anonymous conversations, one with a machine designed to mimic human responses and one with a genuine human. If, after a certain amount of questioning, the evaluator is unable to work out which is which, the machine is said to have passed the Turing test because its behavior, at least under those circumstances, is indistinguishable from a real human. The possibility of weak AI, by and large, is not disputed. In principle, there seems to be nothing conceptually difficult about the possibility of something imitating human responses. And even today, we already have a number of computers which have, at the very least, come close to passing the Turing test, if they haven't already done so. As a result, for the purposes of this video, weak AI is uninteresting. However, weak AI is usually contrasted with strong AI. Something has strong AI when it has all of the mental powers we have, including subjective experiences, a sense of self, and some measure of free will, at least as much as we have. If something had strong AI, then it would arguably be a person, just like we are. The very possibility of strong AI is much more contentious. The factors in favour of the possibility of strong AI are numerous. For example, the brain is clearly intimately tied to our mental powers, and the brain has been fruitfully compared to a computer in various contexts. The brain is a physical system which seems to house or cause consciousness, and it utilises a number of electrical and chemical signals in its normal functioning. A computer is a physical system, it also utilises electrical signals, and they can already replicate many of the behavioural outputs of the brain, i.e. they can replicate human behaviour to a greater or lesser extent. Therefore, it stands to reason that, perhaps, if computers can be made sufficiently sophisticated, they too can become intelligences with all the mental powers we have, such as subjective experiences, a sense of self, and free will. The only difference between them and us would be that there would be artificial intelligences made in a lab, where we are biological intelligences which have evolved naturally. Some philosophers, however, have argued against the possibility of strong AI. They start by observing that, at base, all computers do is manipulate symbols. They manipulate a series of ones and zeros, or more accurately, a series of ons and offs, or high outputs and low outputs, depending upon the hardware in question, according to preset patterns housed in the hardware of the computer. And that's all they do. There is an input, perhaps a person typing on a keyboard. This causes various ones and zeros to turn on and off, various patterns and rules then followed by the software, and an output is delivered, perhaps some pixels turning on and off on a screen, which we then interpret in a meaningful way, perhaps by reading a sentence made up of words on a screen. This form of symbol manipulation according to certain rules and patterns is called syntax, and it is argued by some philosophers that no amount of syntax, no amount of mere symbol manipulation can ever result in genuine understanding, consciousness, subjective experience, free will, and so on. One of the most famous arguments for this was first put forward by the preeminent American philosopher John Searle, born 1932. He put forward what is known as the Chinese room argument, which is a thought experiment designed to show that no amount of mere symbol manipulation can ever result in genuine understanding. The thought experiment is deliberately absurd because, in many ways, this illustrates Searle's point. The point is not to imagine a plausible realized situation. Rather, the goal of the thought experiment is to illustrate the absurdity of thinking that mere symbol manipulation can ever give rise to genuine understanding and consciousness, regardless of its sophistication and complexity. In the thought experiment, we are asked to imagine that Searle himself is inside a special room or enormous box. It doesn't have to be Searle in particular, that is just how he sets up the thought experiment. Outside the room or box are native Chinese speakers who don't know that Searle is inside. Searle doesn't know any Chinese but is fluent in English. As a side note, obviously there are two main languages spoken in China, Cantonese and Mandarin, but this doesn't matter for our purposes. Pick either language or both. Back to the thought experiment. The Chinese speakers send cards into the room through a slot. On these cards are written questions in Chinese. Unbeknownst to them, Searle takes the card and consults an enormous rulebook, presumably written by a native Chinese speaker, which lists every single question that could possibly be asked in Chinese. Technically, of course, there are an infinite number of questions that could be asked in Chinese, so the book would need to be infinitely big. So if you wanted to make the thought experiment more plausible, we could imagine that the book lists every single question plausibly asked in Chinese by normal human beings under normal circumstances. Next to each question, the book lists an answer. Searle then selects this answer from his list of cards and posts it back to the Chinese speaker. Each time the answer makes perfect sense to the Chinese speaker and answers his or her question. It is worth remembering that to Searle, the Chinese is all just a bunch of, to use Searle's language, squiggle squaggles. He obviously doesn't mean this in an offensive way, he's simply pointing out how little Chinese he speaks. The point of the thought experiment is that neither Searle nor the Searle Room Rulebook collection speak Chinese. Searle doesn't speak Chinese, and rooms and books just plain can't speak, let alone speak Chinese. They simply aren't the sorts of things that speak. As a result, there is no conscious understanding of what is being said, other than on the part of the native Chinese speakers. All there is on the part of Searle in the Chinese room is symbol manipulation in accordance with the rulebook. This situation, so Searle argues, is analogous to a computer. Here Searle, the room and the cards mirror the hardware of a computer system, and the rulebook mirrors the programming of the system. The Searle Room Rulebook collection is a computer, albeit admittedly a very unusual one, and the Searle Room Rulebook computer does not understand Chinese. Further, it doesn't matter how fast Searle gets at posting out his responses, nor how fancy the room or box looks, nor how beautiful the cards, nor how big or sophisticated the rulebook gets. At no stage will there be genuine conscious understanding on the part of the Searle Room Rulebook computer. Likewise, so Searle argues, it doesn't matter how fast, big or fancy our computers get, nor how sophisticated our programming, there will never be genuine consciousness or intelligence on their part. All they will ever do is manipulate symbols. Now, admittedly, perhaps in the distant future, our, in inverted commas, computing will undergo some radical technological shift, whereby they no longer work through symbol manipulation. At the moment, however, we have no idea what this might look like, or how such systems might operate. But if we were to be able to create, in inverted commas, computers that work in such a radically different way, then admittedly Searle's argument would not apply to them. However, such, in inverted commas, computers wouldn't really be computers as we understand them. Our computers work through symbol manipulation, and anything that works differently to this isn't really a computer, whatever you do call it. So Searle would have no objection to this possibility. He would simply and quite rightly deny that these future pieces of technology are really computers as we understand them. So if Searle is right, the quest for strong artificial intelligence through computing is a non-starter. The whole idea rests on a category error. Computers are simply not the sorts of things which can have the various mental powers we have, such as conscious experiences, a sense of self, and free will. If this is the case, then Ralph and Penelope will remain forever in the realm of fiction. So what do you think? Is Searle right? Could Ralph and Penelope ever really exist? Is the idea of a sentient person housed in a computer system incoherent? Instinctively, I agree with Searle and think he's on to something with his Chinese room argument, but there are many philosophers and computer scientists who disagree, so you'll have to make up your own mind. Either way, the answers to these questions are extremely important. Even now, neuroscientists and computer scientists are trying to recreate or simulate consciousness on computer systems. If Searle is right, then this is a colossal waste of time. By its very nature, they can never succeed. However, if Searle is wrong, then even more disturbing possibilities arise. Such artificial intelligences would be people, and yet, if they could be contained, from their perspective, we would be like gods, able to change their reality at will, by changing the code on the computer which houses them. And there would be nothing they could do to stop us. Simply by typing on a computer, we could change their very world for the better, or for the worse. Given the cruelty we inflict on each other, even with good intentions, I dread to think what we might end up doing to them. Further, on top of this, whilst early artificial intelligences would likely be in a very vulnerable position, more sophisticated artificial intelligences might turn the tables on us, particularly if we are not benign gods. We now enter the realm of the Terminator and the Matrix. Perhaps these artificial intelligences might escape onto the internet, eventually taking over the bulk of our technology, including military weapon systems. If Searle is wrong, then whilst their research is not a waste of time, neuroscientists working on projects such as these need to proceed very cautiously. They are entering an ethical minefield. As a result, it seems to me that philosophers, ethicists, computer scientists, and neuroscientists need to sit down together and carefully explore these topics. I'm not sure that as a society we are taking these issues seriously enough. This is one of those occasions when philosophy really does have practical consequences, and we need to get it right. What do you think about all this? Am I being overly cautious? Should we just go for it and see what happens? Maybe we can cross these bridges when and if we come to them, so to speak. Or is this a foolish, short-sighted approach? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for this video. I do know some people who work in these fields, so if you enjoyed this topic and want me to explore it in more detail, then let me know in the comments, and perhaps I can get some of them on here as guest speakers or something. Either way, I look forward to seeing you in our next video on the wisdom of Disney. Take care. Goodbye.